Aloha. Welcome to K-Dub's Place. Tonight, our episode, we're going to be drawing from something we call the Nash files. Matter of fact, I had one of these, video things with that concept in mind. I had to erase it because it just wasn't any good. Okay, anyway, what we're going to be doing is reading some excerpts from a book entitled It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time, The Real-Life Antics of a 20th Century Kid, which was written by Kenny Wilson, and if you so desire, you can get the thing at the Amazon Kindle deal if you've got one of those contraptions. Or you can just stay, if you stay watching these things long enough, you'll probably get most of it, under the belt, so to speak. Okay, we're going to be going, starting off here with a little trip to 1969. And I was, early part, I wasn't 16 yet. I think August of that year I turned 16. And this is a little thing about rock and roll music in that year, and especially these guys. Okay. Before I get into discussing my 11th grade experience, but more importantly the year 1970, which proved to be quite a watershed year for me, let's run through some other musical highlights of the year 1969 for me and for the rest of the rock and roll world. Back when the Beatles' White Album was about to come out, I did something that I repeated only 4 more times. That was when I thought it might be out in the stores, I started getting my mom to drive me by the record outlet every day to let me go in to see if it had arrived yet. After about the 4th day, there it was. I immediately got back to the house, put it on, and thought, wow, the White Album, right? The record that prompted me to go to the store every day the next time, in anticipation of its release, was an album by a new group. Actually, the members certainly weren't new. As a matter of fact, they were members of 3 of my favorite bands over the last few years. It, I believe, was the first truly authentic supergroup. From the Byrds came David Crosby, who gave them their vocal sound with all those cool harmonies. From the Hollies came Graham Nash, who gave them their vocal sound with all those cool harmonies. And from the Buffalo Springfield came the great singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist Stephen Stills. When I heard that they had recorded an album, I thought, wow, what's this going to sound like? And there it was. The cover looked so cool and had that unique look and texture to it. I raced home, put it on the turntable, and from the very first strains of the magnificent It was the magnificent, sweet Judy Blue Eyes. I was in awe. This is what I'd been waiting for. It was a sound like no other before it. It took the world of folk rock and gave it true royalty. Their mixture of voices was unearthly and immensely satisfying. Except for the drumming of Dallas Taylor, Stills was basically the band. Except for some rhythm guitar from Crosby, it was all Stephen. Oh, sorry, Graham. I imagine you probably did play on Lady of the Island, but you weren't on the credits for some reason. And the songs, wow. Anyway, I've been a believer ever since. I've had the good fortune to get to know Graham a bit over the years and opened a couple of times for him on Kauai. He's a true gentleman and later on down the literary road, we'll go into my experiences with him on Kauai and elsewhere. When I was wondering if anything good had happened in 1969, it may have been a legitimate question when it comes to national or world politics or news events. but the music that year was amazing and out of this world. From folk rock classics like the Crosby, Stills and Nash album, Bookends, actually 68 was when that came out, but the radio stations were still playing it. And then the Bridge Over Troubled Water, masterpiece of Simon and Garfunkel, the Grateful Dead's Working Man's Dead, Dylan's Nashville Skyline, Bruin, Shipley's Weeds, and Joni Mitchell's Clouds, onto the esoteric rock mix of Santana, Sly and the Family Stones, Stand, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, Neil Young, Electric Ladyland by Hendrix, the second, third, and fourth Creedence Clearwater Revival albums, which were the three best, probably. Volunteers by the Jefferson Airplane, Soul Shakedown, the debut album of Bob Marley and the Wailers. The Stooges and the MC5's debuts, the forerunners of punk rock, of course. The soundtrack from Hair, Elephant Mountain from the Youngbloods, the band. Ballad of Easy Rider by the Byrds, and Chicago, the debut album by, Chicago. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in the Western Hemisphere. Across the pond, they weren't slouching either. With Let It Bleed by the Stones, a Kinks classic, Arthur, the debut from the other supergroup formed that year, Clapton, Winwood, Ginger Baker, and Rick Gretsch. Blind Faith, of course. The Who's Tommy, all sorts of progressive rock albums by the Moody Blues, Procol Harum, Genesis, Pink Floyd, yes, and leading that charge, the debut album of King Crimson with In the Court of the Crimson King. I almost forgot to throw in the first two Led Zeppelin albums. Some people refer to them as a supergroup, but I'm not one of them. I mean, they became a supergroup because they were a pretty super group. But, as far as supergroups are supposed to be like you bring the big guys from all the big bands, and that's not exactly what was happening here. I mean, even though John Paul Jones was a busy studio player and had played on many known recordings before that, Jimmy Page was the only cat that a number of people had heard of outside of England. So to me, it doesn't count. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention the comeback album from Elvis in Memphis, which brought us the first three hit songs, Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, and Kentucky Rain. The first three songs that he had had in eons. Sorry. Even Steve Miller was making good music back then. Is that enough for you? Oh yeah. Ever heard of the Beatles? Like, does Let It Be and Abbey Road ring a bell? I'm worn out just thinking about it. On May 4th of 1970, Ohio National Guardsmen opened fire on a group of students protesting the recent invasion into Cambodia, killing 4 of those students. Neil Young saw it on the TV, wrote the song, got his buddies to record it, I believe that night. I think it happened really fast, and within a couple of weeks, the radio stations were playing Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. It was amazing how fast that thing was put together and aired. The Deja Vu album had just been released as well, and Teach Your Children was going up the charts. That was another one of those times that I knew the album was coming out at a certain time. I'm talking about Deja Vu now. And I drove to the record store every day looking for it. And there it was. It had another timeless, fantastic cover. And when I heard Carry On, which is the first song on the record, it was another moment of awe. The production quality was far superior to their first album, in my humble opinion. As a matter of fact, I think it's the best produced album they ever did, which is not to shortchange the ones that came after. It was just so good. I was fortunate to see the Crosby, Stills and Nash show in Baltimore about a couple weeks or so after Ohio started playing on the radio. The concert hall was charged with revolution when they got there, especially during the playing of that song. At our school there was a little protest going on where a bunch of us cut class and went out to the front of the school underneath the American flag flying to protest the war and those shootings. A bunch of ignorant thugs came out of the building and started beating up some of our protesters. I didn't get beat up, but was sent home from school that day for being out there at the demonstration. When I got home, I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to explain to my mother what had happened. I just couldn't finish up without tearing up. The thing kind of affected me. She got the point.
Tin soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming for dead in Ohio.
Okay, now we're jumping from 1970 to I believe 1972. Of course, there was still great music pouring out of the radio, and it just wouldn't stop. Early in the year, an album by a guy I hadn't heard of came out, and I thought the song of his that they were playing was pretty cool. It was a little thing called Doctor My Eyes by Jackson Browne. His voice is great, and it just sounded different in some kind of way. The rest of the album was solid as well, and before too long he became one of my favorite singers and songwriters. And I've sung many of his songs over the years. And it was also cool that he had Crosby and Nash harmonizing with him on Doctor. As a matter of fact, I saw him open for Joni Mitchell at Constitution Hall right after the album came out. Not a bad opening act. And speaking of Crosby and Nash, their pal Neil Young put out what was probably the most successful commercial album of his career. I've been fortunate to get to know Graham Nash a bit over the years, and I went into D.C. one night to see and hear him speak and sing at a little thing in December of, I'm thinking 2003. He said at one point that Young was definitely the weirdest cat he'd ever known, and proceeded to tell a story to illustrate that fact. Apparently, Neil had invited him up to his ranch in Northern California sometime in 1971, and while seated at dinner, asked Nash if he'd be interested in hearing some tracks that he had put together for his upcoming album. Of course, Graham said, "Yeah, sure, Neil, that'd be great." A little more English accent. So they finished their meal, got properly tuned up for the listening, and the host asked his guest to follow him down to the lake, which was located just outside of the house and the barn where Young's studio was located. When they got down to the lake, Neil said that they needed to get in the boat and go out into the middle of the lake, which was located, not the middle of the lake. A little wary of his friend's plan, Nash said, "Sure, Neil, whatever you say." He then rowed out to the middle, and the resident engineer for the studio came down to the lake and yelled out to his boss, "Are you ready to turn it on?" Young answered in the affirmative, and the guy went back to the barn. Apparently Neil had created an outdoor speaker system with one set of speakers emanating from the barn, the other from the main house, and the perfect spot to get the stereo effect was right where they were seated in that boat in the middle of the lake. And the engineer was asked to play the tracks real loud. So there they were, Neil Young and Graham Nash sitting in a rowboat in the middle of this lake, while the almost finished tracks of the new album came pouring out of this unique sound system. After it was played out, Graham was asked what he thought and told his friend that it was incredible. The guy pushing the buttons inside must have been Elliot Mazer. I'm not really sure, but that's my guess. Here we go. Oh, and the engineer was after it was played out, it was incredible. The guy pushing the buttons inside came back out to the lake and asked Neil how it sounded. Neil yelled back, "More barn." The album was Harvest and became a classic during that great music year of 1972. And speaking of Neil Young, there was another album that came out earlier that year. When some people heard the first hit from that record, they actually thought it might be another Neil Young song. Yeah, right. The song was Horse with No Name by some guys who called themselves America, rather, well, I don't know, pretentiously, if you ask me. The blonde guy in that group was the one who lived down the street from me in Annandale for a while before hooking up with the other guys. Remember, he had the good-looking sister, golden hair. They went on to have quite a few hits, and I even purchased a couple of those albums. But they never sounded like Neil Young to me.
Okay, now we're gonna bounce all the way to 2008 for a little thing that happened on election day of that year. Also, I thought it necessary to see my family again. I believe it was right after the national election that I planned to go see my California unit, and I made plans to do just that for a few days. But before that was to be, the election was to take place. It was to be Barack Obama against John McCain and, what's her name? My main man, Ralph Nader, was still kicking at that point, and as usual, had been treated quite poorly by the powers that be during the whole thing. That certainly didn't deter me, though, and on the day of voting, I proudly went and cast my lot for that great American. As I mentioned before, there was also another special event coming into my life that night. Crosby and Nash were to be performing at the Sheldon Concert Hall, which is a rather small little place, but beautiful and acoustically wonderful. When I first heard that they were going to play, I thought, well, it would be just the two of them, which would have been great in its own right. But it turned out that they had their whole incredible band that was showing up as well. It may be hard to express to you how strange this was, but this place is really small. So small that there's no real backstage area as one would normally expect. The backstage area was pretty much a curtain across the front of the stage with the musicians getting ready behind it. There was a small little anteroom, if you will, off to the side, but it was way too small for them to congregate in. And to try to explain further, it was so small that the guy running the sound system was seated right in front of the stage on the side instead of out in the middle of the room, like big-time concerts are usually worked. And Crosby and Nash were big Obama supporters, so there was electricity in the air for more than one reason. Now, as I reminisced upon earlier, I had communicated to Graham the fact that I was intending to attend this great event. But this had been a number of months ago, and I believe I even bought tickets to the thing. I think I ended up giving the tickets to a couple of friends because Nash communicated to me that he was going to have put aside a couple of tickets and backstage passes for me, which I figured Azad and I would take. And he's the kind of guy that has that stuff together. That had been my experience in the past. The day of the show, after voting, I went to hang out with my pal Richard, who, as I mentioned earlier, was doing the tour manager thing for those guys. When I mentioned that Nash had told me of the tickets and passes thing, Richard suggested that he put aside a couple of passes because he wasn't quite sure that the tickets would be available due to the fact that the thing had been sold out a long time ago. And he didn't come right out and say it, but I got the impression that there probably weren't any seats left to give out. Okay, yeah, whatever. So my pal and I went down to the gig, and when I got to the will call window, I gave the gal my name and said that I was supposed to have tickets and passes for the show. She didn't see my name on the list, so she asked me who had given me the info that they might exist. I said that Graham Nash had personally told me this. She ducked into the other room and returned with a higher-up who asked me the same question as to who had promised these offerings. I gave her the same info, and she ducked back out the booth. When she came back, she said to follow her and that Richard would see us. At that point, I knew everything would be okay with my pal doing the deal. When Azad and I got into that ante-room that I mentioned before, Richard came out to meet us, and I told him the situation, and he said he'd straighten it out.
This was about 5 minutes before the curtain was about to rise and the show was about to start. A pal walked into the stage area where the performers were getting ready to do their thing, and I heard Richard's voice say, "Graham, Kenny didn't get his tickets." Immediately, Nash came over to where we were and said, "Oh, Kenny, sorry about that. Rich will take care of you." Then he shook my hand, I introduced Azad, and he shook his hand, and then he returned to the stage, and the curtain came up, and they started the gig. After all that got going, Richard said that he'd get some space put aside for us next to the sound guy at the side of the stage. He brought in a couple of chairs, and the sound guy didn't seem to care all that much, and we ended up with great seats to the show. We were on the side, but we could see all the cats, especially those in the front line, which included the two stars, as well as Dean Parks, one of the great studio guitar players of all time, who's doing the lead guitar work, of course. Every once in a while, Graham would catch our eyes and give us a nod, so yeah, it was very cool. At the halfway mark, they took a break, and during that time, it was made public that Obama had indeed won the presidential election. When the boys came back on stage, they were ecstatic. The second half of the show was electric and moving, and even though I didn't vote for the guy that time, I felt that this was the most symbolically profound moment in American political history. It was an amazing night for Azad and I, and I'll remember it always. Thanks again, Richard and Graham. Okay, I got just a couple little tidbits to throw in here before we wind down this little episode. Okay, now we're gonna go take up a step back. 82, 83. Back to the early days when I had found myself on the lovely island of Kauai. Anyway, everyone. Another guy who befriended me early on in my years on Kauai is two-time Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, Graham Nash. First time I was ever in close proximity to him was in D.C. the afternoon before his Crosby and Nash performance. I think probably out at Merriweather Post Pavilion. I think it might have been 76. Just guessing. Anyway, he was giving an interview at some radio station that day. So I went up the elevator to the studio with a copy of my Flying Together album. As the door of the elevator opened, he walked in with whomever, and I gave him the album. He looked at the picture on the back of Diane Daisy, my dog, and myself, and said that it reminded him of a picture that he had of himself and his cat. I think I actually saw that picture. I kind of know what he's talking about. The next time I was in close proximity to him was one morning on Kauai, fairly shortly after my getting there. I was having breakfast at the country kitchen, as were Graham and his wife Susan. I finished first, so I went to the car to get a copy of one of my albums. This would have been the Fill in the Measure album, I'm sure. As he was leaving, I was able to give him a copy of the said album. Now, first of all, when I give any rock star a copy of any recording I've ever done, it's not to garner their favor, or expect them to get me a recording contract or something of that nature. Actually, I think I've only done this really with Graham and Todd Rundgren, possibly Michael Brewer. Anyway, I do it, I guess, just to let them know that I exist, and if they were to actually listen to the thing, they might see their influence on me in some sort of abstract way, if nothing else. My ambitions have never been any more grandiose than that, and Graham's always been very kind to me all these years. I'm not sure why, because in his position I'm sure he gets a lot of clowns hitting him up with this and that, and without knowing me it would simply seem like I'm in that category. But he's never treated me that way. One time something went down between us that could have ended the relationship altogether. I just gotten the copies of my third album discussed a few pages back, and I was talking to my buddy Eddie, who finally got home after the horrendous ordeal with his leg almost being lost, and he said that he knew where Graham's condo in Princeville was, and that I should drop an album or two at the door. It sounded a little weird, but I did it anyway. 2 or 3 months later, Graham and I are both to be playing music at a fundraiser for the island school, a private facility where both his kids and my brother's kids were attending. When we were both there setting up for the evening's entertainment, Susan Nash and I were saying hello, and she asked me if I'd been calling their place in Princeville. Apparently, just after I left those albums at their door, they started getting strange phone calls. Great. Boy, did I feel like a jerk. I assured her that I had never done such a thing and would never consider doing such a thing. I was just dropping off my latest recording, nothing more, nothing less. She said that was a relief and went back to whatever she was doing prior to talking to me. When I got up to do my set, she and Graham sat in seats right in front of me and stayed for the entire performance, clapping enthusiastically after everything I sang and played. Their friendship overwhelmed me at that point. On another occasion, I entered the country kitchen again to dine on some of their fine breakfast offerings, and Graham and Susan were there as well. Susan invited me to join them, which I did. During our breakfast, I was invited to come to their house in Honolulu on Christmas Day, which was just a few days away, where they were having a bunch of friends over for the festivities. I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, who could possibly be there? You know, Crosby, Jackson, Stephen, Joni, Russ Kunkel, Leland Sklar, I don't know. I said that I'd love to, but when it came time to make the move, I completely froze up and decided to go to my brother's house on Christmas Day instead, where I knew I would find comfort and a good time. The other thing just scared the shit out of me. The point of all this, of course, is that Susan and Graham have been incredibly cool all of these years since our first meeting. And thanks to both of them. And I will wind this little episode down right now. So, till we meet again, aloha no, and aloha yes.